George Strait kicks his wife out of the house. What she discovers makes her cry. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling Texas ranch as Norma Strait carefully arranged fresh wildflowers in the crystal vase that had graced their kitchen table for over 3 decades. At 71 years old, her movement still held the grace of the young woman who had captured the heart of a future country music legend back when he was just George Harvey Strait Jr., a college student with big dreams and an even bigger smile. "George, your coffee's getting cold," she called out, her voice carrying the familiar warmth that had comforted him through countless early morning departures for tours, late-night recording sessions, and the devastating moments that had tested their marriage beyond measure. But this morning something felt different. The silence that greeted her words wasn't the comfortable quiet of a man absorbed in reading the morning paper or checking cattle reports. This silence carried weight, an unspoken tension that made the hair on Norma's arm stand on end. George appeared in the doorway of their kitchen, his tall frame filling the space as it had for 54 years of marriage. The man who had sold over 100 million records worldwide, who had been inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, and who had earned the title King of Country, stood before his wife with an expression she had never seen before. His steel blue eyes, usually so warm when they looked at her, seemed distant and cold. "Norma, we need to talk," he said, his voice lacking its usual tenderness. The hands that had held guitars, signed autographs for millions of fans, and dried her tears during their darkest hours now hung stiffly at his sides. She turned from the flowers, her heart beginning to race with a fear she couldn't name. In all their years together, through the loss of their daughter Jennifer in that terrible car accident in 1986, through the pressures of fame and the constant demands on their privacy, George had never spoken to her with such formality. "What is it, honey?" "You're scaring me," Norma whispered, setting down the delicate stems with trembling fingers. If you're enjoying this story and want to know what happens next, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers, and your support means everything to us as we continue to share these incredible true stories of love, hope, and unexpected surprises. George walked to the large window that overlooked their property, the same window where they had watched their children play, where they had discussed George's career decisions, and where they had held each other during the most difficult times of their lives. But now he stood with his back to her, his shoulders tense beneath his favorite blue shirt. "I need you to leave the house today, Norma. Pack some things and go somewhere else. Don't come back until tonight." The words hit her like a physical blow. Norma gripped the edge of the marble countertop, her knuckles turning white as she struggled to process what she had just heard. In 54 years of marriage, George had never asked her to leave. Even during their rare arguments, even when the pressures of his career had strained their relationship to its breaking point, home had always been their sanctuary. "Leave? George, what are you talking about? This is my home too. Our home." Her voice cracked on the last words, betraying the panic that was building in her chest. "Just do as I ask, Norma, please." He still wouldn't turn around, wouldn't look at her. "Take whatever you need for the day. Go shopping, visit Martha, I don't care. Just don't be here." Tears began to blur her vision as Norma stared at the back of the man she had loved since she was 17 years old. This was the same George who had written her love letters from basic training, who had proposed to her in a field of bluebonnets, who had sung Amarillo Morning to her on their wedding day because it was her favorite song. This was the man who had held her hand through the devastating loss of their daughter, who had turned down countless lucrative opportunities to be present for their son Bubba's baseball games, who had always made her feel like the most important person in his world. "George, please look at me," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what's wrong. Whatever it is, we can work through it together. We always have." For a moment she thought she saw his shoulders soften, thought she detected the faintest tremor in his stance. But when he finally turned around, his face was a mask of cold determination that she didn't recognize. "There's nothing to work through, Norma. I just need some space today, some time to think." His words were clipped, efficient, as if he were discussing business matters rather than the potential destruction of their life together. Norma felt as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting, as if the solid foundation of her entire existence was crumbling away. This kitchen, where they had shared thousands of meals, where George had taught their children to play guitar, where they had planned their future together, suddenly felt foreign and unwelcoming. "How long have you been feeling this way?" she asked, her voice stronger now, though her heart was breaking. How long have you been planning to get rid of me? I'm not getting rid of you, George said quickly, and for the first time that morning, she heard something that might have been regret in his voice. I just need today, Norma, just give me today. She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. The George she knew would never hurt her like this, would never send her away without explanation. But this stranger wearing her husband's face seemed determined to do exactly that. With dignity she didn't know she possessed, Norma walked past him to their bedroom. Her hands shook as she packed a small overnight bag, choosing items almost randomly. A change of clothes, her jewelry box, the framed photo of Jennifer that always traveled with her. Each item felt like a small betrayal, as if she were complying with her own exile. George was nowhere to be seen when she emerged from the bedroom, her purse clutched tightly in one hand and her overnight bag in the other. The house that had been filled with 54 years of love and laughter now felt empty and hollow, as if all the memories had been sucked out of it in the span of a single conversation. She paused at the front door, hoping against hope that George would appear, that he would take her in his arms and tell her this had all been some terrible mistake. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of cattle and the rustle of wind through the oak trees they had planted together when they were newlyweds. As Norma drove down the long gravel driveway that led away from the only home she had known as George Strait's wife, she caught sight of him in her rearview mirror. He stood on the front porch watching her leave, and for just a moment she thought she saw him raise his hand as if to wave goodbye. But when she looked again, he was gone, disappeared back into the house that no longer felt like hers. The Texas highway stretched endlessly before her, and Norma realized she had no idea where she was going. For the first time in over 5 decades, she was completely alone, cast out from the life she had helped build, rejected by the man who had once promised to love her until his dying day. As the tears finally came, flowing freely down her cheeks, she wondered if she would ever understand what had gone so terribly wrong, or if this morning marked the end of the greatest love story she had ever known. The radio crackled to life, and cruelly, ironically, George's voice filled the car, singing about love that lasts forever. Norma reached over and turned it off, unable to bear the sound of promises that now seemed as fragile as morning mist. 20 minutes into her aimless drive through the winding back roads of Texas, Norma's cell phone rang. The familiar ringtone of Waltz Across Texas made her heart skip a beat. For a moment, she thought it might be George calling to apologize, to beg her to come home, but when she glanced at the screen through her tears, she saw Martha Henderson's name instead. Martha had been her closest friend for over 30 years, ever since they had met at a charity event in San Antonio, when George's career was just beginning to take off. She was one of the few people who knew Norma not as George Strait's wife, but simply as Norma Jean, the woman who loved to garden, who made the best peach cobbler in 3 counties, and who had dreams and fears that had nothing to do with country music or fame. "Hello?" Norma answered, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "Norma, honey, I was just thinking about you." Martha's warm voice came through the speaker. "I know this is last minute, but I'm sitting here at Rosita's Cafe in town and I just ordered way too much food. Would you like to join me for lunch? I hate eating alone, and I feel like we haven't caught up properly in weeks." The timing was so perfect, so providential, that Norma almost started crying again. Here she was, cast out from her own home with nowhere to go, and her dearest friend was offering exactly what she needed. A place to be, someone to sit with, a distraction from the nightmare her mourning had become. "I'd love that, Martha," Norma managed, her voice only slightly shaky. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. "Wonderful. I'll order you the chicken fried steak. I know it's your favorite." As Norma ended the call and turned her car toward town, she tried to compose herself. Martha was perceptive, and she would notice immediately if something was wrong. How could Norma possibly explain that her husband of 54 years had essentially thrown her out of their home? How could she admit that the man everyone saw as the perfect gentleman, the devoted family man, had treated her like an unwanted stranger? Rosita's Cafe sat on Main Street in the heart of their small Texas town, a place where George had once been just another local boy with a guitar and big dreams. Now, 23 years after his last #1 hit, the walls were covered with photos of him and memorabilia from his career. Norma usually enjoyed seeing the pride their community took in George's success, but today, walking past those images felt like salt in an open wound. Martha waved from a corner booth, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the Texas heat, her smile as genuine and welcoming as always. She wore a light blue dress that matched her eyes, and her face lit up when she saw Norma approaching. "There's my favorite person," Martha said, standing to embrace her friend. But as soon as their arms wrapped around each other, Norma felt Martha stiffen slightly. "Honey, are you all right? You look like you've been crying." Norma forced a smile and slid into the booth across from her friend. "Just allergies. You know how they get this time of year. All those wildflowers blooming." Martha studied her with the keen eye of someone who had raised 4 children and knew when she was being told a partial truth. "Allergies, And here, I thought you loved wildflower season. Didn't you just tell me last week that you were planning to plant more bluebonnets along the fence line?" The waitress appeared before Norma had to answer, setting down a plate of chicken fried steak with cream gravy, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The sight of her favorite comfort food made her throat tight with emotion. How many times had George surprised her with this exact meal when she was feeling down? How many times had he driven into town just to pick up Rosita's chicken fried steak because he knew it would make her smile? "Martha, can I ask you something?" Norma said, cutting into her steak with more force than necessary. "In all the years you've known Jim, has he ever asked you to leave the house? I mean, really asked you to go away for a whole day?" Martha set down her fork and leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "Norma, what's going on? And don't tell me it's allergies, because I know you better than that." For a moment, Norma considered telling her everything. Martha would listen without judgment, would offer comfort and advice. But the shame was too great, the humiliation too fresh. How could she admit that after 54 years of what everyone considered the perfect marriage, her husband no longer wanted her around? "He's been distant lately," Norma said carefully, which wasn't entirely untrue. George had been working on something in his home studio for weeks, staying up late and being secretive about his projects. "I just wonder sometimes if men go through phases where they need space." "All men need space sometimes," Martha said gently. "But the good ones, the ones like George and my Jim, they don't make their wives feel unwanted when they need that space. They communicate. They explain." The words hit harder than Martha could have known. George hadn't explained anything. He had simply commanded her to leave, as if their decades together meant nothing, as if she were an employee who could be dismissed rather than a partner who deserved respect and honesty. "Tell me something good," Norma said, desperate to change the subject. "How are the grandchildren?" Martha launched into stories about her youngest grandson's Little League games and her granddaughter's piano recital, and for a few blessed minutes, Norma was able to lose herself in the normalcy of someone else's happiness. She laughed at the right moments, asked the right questions, and almost managed to forget the devastation of the morning. But as the afternoon wore on, the weight of her situation pressed down on her again. She had nowhere to go when lunch ended. She couldn't return home until evening, and the thought of facing George again, of seeing that cold stranger wearing her husband's face, made her stomach turn. "What are your plans for the rest of the day?" Martha asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Oh, you know, errands and such," Norma lied. "I should probably get going soon." "Actually," Martha said, her voice taking on a slightly mysterious tone, "I was wondering if you might want to do some shopping. I heard that new boutique in Fredericksburg got in some beautiful summer dresses. We could make an afternoon of it." Something in Martha's manner seemed odd, almost rehearsed, but Norma was in no position to be suspicious. An afternoon of shopping would keep her occupied, would prevent her from driving aimlessly around Texas, thinking about how her marriage might be ending. "That sounds lovely," Norma said, and meant it. As they left the cafe together, Norma caught a glimpse of herself in the restaurant's window. She looked older than her 71 years, worn down by the morning's emotional assault. Her grey hair, usually perfectly styled, looked disheveled, and her eyes were still red from crying. But something else caught her attention in the reflection. A man sitting in a pickup truck across the street quickly looked away when she glanced in his direction. She couldn't see his face clearly, but something about his build, the way he held his shoulders, seemed familiar. "Martha," she said slowly, "do you know who that is in the blue pickup?" Martha followed her gaze and shrugged. "Can't say I do, honey." "Why?" "No reason," Norma said, but a strange feeling settled in her stomach. First George's inexplicable behavior, then Martha's perfectly timed lunch invitation, and now a mysterious man watching her from across the street. Was she being paranoid? Or was something more complex happening than she understood? As they walked to Martha's car, Norma couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important, that there were pieces to this puzzle that she couldn't see. But what could be so important that George would risk their marriage to achieve it? What secret could be worth causing her this much pain? The blue pickup pulled away from the curb as they drove toward Fredericksburg, staying just far enough behind them to seem coincidental. Norma watched it in the side mirror, her heart beginning to race with a mixture of fear and something else she couldn't quite identify, something that almost felt like hope, though she couldn't imagine why. Meanwhile, back at the Strait ranch, George stood in the middle of his living room, his hands on his hips, surveying what looked like organized chaos. The furniture had been pushed against the walls, and a small army of people moved with purposeful efficiency throughout his home. Florists arranged massive displays of white roses, Norma's favorite flowers since their first date when he had picked them from his mother's garden because he couldn't afford to buy any. "Mr. Strait, where do you want the musicians to set up?" asked Linda Rodriguez, the event coordinator he had hired 3 weeks ago to orchestrate this elaborate surprise. She was a tiny woman with enormous energy and an attention to detail that had made her the most sought-after wedding planner in 3 counties. "In front of the fireplace," George replied, his voice tight with nervous energy. "Norma always loved when I played there during family gatherings. She said the acoustics made my voice sound like an angel." Linda made notes on her clipboard while directing 2 men carrying a portable sound system. "And the photographer, where would you like him positioned?" George glanced around the room that had witnessed 54 years of their life together. The same room where they had celebrated Christmas mornings with their children, where they had slow danced to the radio on countless Saturday nights, where they had held each other and grieved after Jennifer's funeral. Today, it would witness something else entirely, a renewal of vows that would hopefully remind Norma that despite his cruel behavior this morning, she remained the most important thing in his world. "Wherever he can capture her face when she walks in," George said softly. "I want to remember that moment for the rest of my life." The front door opened, and George's longtime bass player, Mike Daly, walked in carrying his instrument case. Behind him came Johnny Gimble on fiddle and Tommy Foote with his steel guitar. These weren't just musicians to George, they were family, men who had traveled the world with him, who had shared stages from honky-tonk bars to Madison Square Garden. "George, you old romantic fool," Mike said with a grin, setting down his bass. "When you called and told me what you were planning, I thought you'd lost your mind. But seeing this setup, I'm starting to think you might be a genius." "I hope so," George muttered, running his hands through his graying hair. "Because if this backfires, I might have just destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me." Johnny Gimble, at 80 years old, still one of the finest fiddle players in country music, chuckled as he tuned his instrument. "Son, I've known you and Norma for over 20 years. That woman loves you more than life itself. She's going to forgive you for this morning's theatrics when she sees what you've done." "But what if she doesn't?" George asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him all day. "What if I hurt her so badly that she can't see past it? What if she walks in here and just sees the man who threw her out of her own home?" Tommy Foote looked up from adjusting his steel guitar. "Then you'll spend the rest of your life making it up to her, which is exactly what a good husband should do when he makes a mistake, even a mistake made with good intentions." In the kitchen, caterers from Norma's favorite restaurant in San Antonio were preparing her favorite meal, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables and the lemon meringue pie that had been served at their original wedding reception 54 years ago. George had tracked down the recipe from the long-closed bakery that had made their wedding cake, calling in favors and making donations to ensure every detail was perfect. George's son Bubba arrived carrying a box of photographs that George had requested. Now 37 years old and the spitting image of his father, Bubba had initially been skeptical of his father's plan. "Dad, are you sure about this approach?" Bubba asked, setting the box on the kitchen counter. "Mum was really upset when she left this morning. I saw her drive past the main gate and she looked like she'd been crying." "I know," George said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I know I hurt her, son, but I couldn't think of any other way to get her out of the house long enough to set this up. You know your mother. If she had even the slightest suspicion that something was happening, she would have insisted on helping, on taking care of everyone else, instead of letting us take care of her." Bubba nodded, understanding his mother's selfless nature. "She's always been that way. Remember when you surprised her with the trip to Hawaii for her 50th birthday? She spent the entire week worrying about whether you were eating properly and if the horses were being fed on schedule." Exactly, George said, beginning to sort through the photographs. This time, she's going to be the center of attention. No taking care of anyone else, no worrying about whether the guests are comfortable. Tonight is about celebrating her, about showing her how grateful I am for everything she's sacrificed for our family. The photographs chronicled their entire relationship, their high school graduation, their simple wedding ceremony in Pearsall, the early days of George's career when they lived in a tiny apartment and survived on love and dreams. There were pictures from George's first recording contract, from award shows where Norma stood proudly beside him, from family vacations and quiet moments at home. One photograph in particular caught George's attention. Norma holding baby Jennifer in the hospital, her face glowing with maternal joy, while 2-year-old Bubba stood on a chair beside the bed, reaching out to touch his new sister's tiny hand. It had been taken 39 years ago, before tragedy struck their family, before they learned that love could survive even the most devastating losses. "Put this one on the mantel," George said, handing the photo to Bubba. "I want her to see it when she walks in. I want her to remember that we've been through the worst possible thing together, and we survived because we had each other." The afternoon progressed with military precision. Linda coordinated the arrival of extended family members who had flown in from across the country. George's sister from Oklahoma, Norma's cousin from Louisiana, childhood friends who hadn't seen the couple in years but who had dropped everything when George called and explained his plan. George's brother-in-law, Jim, arrived with his wife carrying a garment bag that contained Norma's surprise outfit for the evening, a recreation of her original wedding dress, made by the same seamstress who had altered it for their actual wedding 54 years ago. The seamstress, now 86 years old, had worked from old photographs and her own memories to create something that would transport Norma back to that magical day when they were 19 and 20 years old, full of hope and completely unaware of the incredible journey that lay ahead of them. "She's going to cry when she sees this," Jim's wife, Sarah, said, carefully hanging the dress in the master bedroom. "I almost cried just watching Mrs. Patterson work on it. She kept talking about how young and beautiful Norma was, how excited she was about marrying George." George touched the delicate lace sleeves, remembering how his breath had caught in his throat when Norma had walked down the aisle of the small church in Pearsall. She had been the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and somehow, miraculously, she had chosen him. "I hope she still feels that way about marrying me," George said quietly. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch, George received a text message from Martha. 20 minutes out. She suspects something but doesn't know what. Get ready. George's heart began to pound as he made final adjustments to his tie. He had chosen the same style of suit he had worn to their wedding, down to the silver cufflinks that had been his father's. Every detail had been planned to recreate the magic of their original ceremony, while honoring the decades of love and partnership that had followed. The musicians took their positions, the family members found their hiding spots, and the photographer positioned himself to capture Norma's reaction. George stood by the front door, his hands trembling slightly as he heard the distant sound of a car approaching on the gravel driveway. In just a few minutes, he would either witness the most beautiful surprise of their marriage, or he would have to face the consequences of breaking the heart of the woman he loved more than his own life. As the headlights swept across the front windows of their home, George whispered a prayer that love and trust built over 54 years would be stronger than the pain he had caused in a single morning. Norma sat in the passenger seat of Martha's car, her stomach churning with a mixture of dread and confusion as they turned into the familiar driveway of her home. The afternoon of shopping in Fredericksburg had been a welcome distraction, but now, facing the prospect of confronting George again, all her fears came rushing back. "Martha, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," Norma said as they drove slowly up the gravel path. "Have you been in contact with George today?" Martha's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "Why would you ask that, honey?" "Because your lunch invitation came at exactly the right moment. Because you suggested shopping at exactly the right time to keep me away all day. Because you keep checking your phone like you're expecting messages." Norma turned to study her friend's profile in the gathering dusk. "Because I've known you for 30 years, Martha Henderson, and you're a terrible liar." Martha pulled the car to a stop in front of the house and turned off the engine. In the silence that followed, Norma became aware of something unusual. Soft light glowed from every window of her home, warmer and more golden than their usual evening lighting. And was that music she heard, drifting faintly through the closed car windows? Norma, Martha said gently, reaching over to take her friend's hand. Sometimes the people who love us most have to hurt us a little bit in order to give us something beautiful. Sometimes a small betrayal is necessary for a much larger gift. Before Norma could respond, the front door of her home opened and George appeared in the doorway. But this wasn't the cold stranger who had banished her that morning. This was her George, dressed in a suit remarkably similar to the one he had worn on their wedding day, his face soft with love and nervous anticipation. "Oh my God," Norma whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "Martha, what's happening?" "Go find out," Martha said with a smile that was part mischief and part tears. "Go see what that foolish romantic husband of yours has been planning." Norma stepped out of the car on trembling legs, her eyes never leaving George's face as he walked slowly toward her. The man who had seemed like a stranger 12 hours ago was now completely, unmistakably himself again. The coldness was gone, replaced by an expression of such tender vulnerability that it took her breath away. "Norma Jean," he said softly, using the nickname that only he was allowed to speak. "My beautiful Norma Jean. Can you ever forgive a foolish old man for breaking your heart this morning?" "George, I don't understand," she whispered, but even as she spoke, pieces were beginning to fall into place. The mysterious phone calls she had overheard, the secretive meetings in his studio, the way he had been asking odd questions about their wedding day. "I needed you to leave so I could prepare something for you," George said, taking her hands in his. "Something that required absolute secrecy because I know you, sweetheart. I know that if you had even suspected what I was planning, you would have insisted on helping, on taking care of everyone else, instead of letting us take care of you." Tears began to stream down Norma's face as understanding dawned. "Our anniversary, our 54th anniversary is next week, and I wanted to do something special, something that would show you how grateful I am for every single day you've spent as my wife, every sacrifice you've made, every time you've put our family before your own dreams." George's voice cracked with emotion. "I wanted to give you the celebration you deserved 54 years ago, when we were too young and too poor to do anything more than a simple ceremony." He led her toward the house, and as they approached the front door, Norma could hear it clearly now, the sound of familiar voices and gentle music floating from within. Her heart began to race with anticipation rather than fear. "George, how many people are in our house right now?" she asked, laughing through her tears. "Everyone who loves you," he replied simply. "Everyone who wanted to be here to celebrate the most incredible woman I've ever known." When George opened the front door, Norma gasped. Their living room had been transformed into something magical. White roses filled every corner, their sweet fragrance perfuming the air. Photographs from their 54 years together lined the walls, chronicling their journey from young newlyweds to grandparents. And there, arranged in front of their fireplace, were some of the most talented musicians in country music, ready to serenade her. But it was the sight of the people gathered in her home that truly overwhelmed her. Family members she hadn't seen in months, friends from across the country, neighbors who had become like extended family over the decades. They had all come here, to her home, to celebrate her marriage and her life. "Surprise!" they called out in unison, but their voices were soft, reverent, as if they understood the sacred nature of what was happening. Norma's sister flew across the room to embrace her, followed by George's brother, their children's godparents, and a dozen other beloved faces. Each hug, each kiss on the cheek, each whispered, "We're so happy to be here," filled the hollow space in her heart that George's morning rejection had created. "There's more," George said quietly in her ear as she was surrounded by loved ones. "This is just the beginning." He led her to the master bedroom, where hanging on the closet door was a sight that made her legs weak with emotion. It was her wedding dress, not the original which had long since been stored away and was too fragile to wear, but a perfect recreation, sewn with the same love and attention to detail that had gone into the original. "Mrs. Patterson made it," George said, watching her face carefully. "Do you remember her? She altered your dress for our wedding. She's 86 now, but when I called and explained what I wanted to do, she insisted on making this herself. She said it was an honor to dress a bride for the same man twice." Norma reached out to touch the delicate lace, remembering the excitement of that long-ago morning when she had put on her wedding dress for the first time. She had been 19 years old, madly in love with a boy who sang in local clubs and dreamed of making it in Nashville. She could never have imagined the life that lay ahead of them, the triumphs and tragedies, the incredible journey they would take together. "You want to marry me again," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I want to marry you every day for the rest of my life," George replied. "But today I want to do it in front of everyone who matters to us, with the music and flowers and celebration that you deserved the first time. I want to promise you again that you are my heart, my home, my everything." As Norma changed into the beautiful dress, assisted by her sister and Martha, she felt herself transforming back into that young bride who had been so certain that love would conquer everything. The dress fit perfectly, as if Mrs. Patterson had somehow captured not just her measurements, but her essence, the girl she had been and the woman she had become. When she emerged from the bedroom, George was waiting in the hallway, and the look on his face was exactly the same as it had been 54 years ago when she had walked down the aisle of the little church in Pearsall. Wonder, gratitude, and a love so deep it seemed to illuminate him from within. "Ready to marry me again, Mrs. Strait?" he asked, offering her his arm. "I thought you'd never ask, Mr. Strait," she replied, and together they walked toward their living room, toward their friends and family, toward a renewal of the promises that had sustained them through more than half a century of life together. As they entered the transformed living room, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. The soft lighting cast everything in a golden glow, and the musicians began to play the opening notes of Amarillo Morning, the song that had been their first dance as husband and wife. But tonight George had arranged for something even more special. He stepped forward, taking the microphone that Mike Daly handed him, and looked out at the faces of everyone who had shaped their lives together. His voice, still strong and clear after decades of performing, carried the weight of every emotion he had felt that day. "Friends, family, thank you for being here tonight to help me honor the most remarkable woman I've ever known," George began, his eyes never leaving Norma's face. 54 years ago, I married a girl who believed in my dreams, even when I didn't believe in them myself. She followed me from small-town Texas to Nashville and back again, raised our children while I chased songs across the country, and somehow managed to keep our family together through triumphs and tragedies that would have broken lesser people. The room was completely silent, except for the gentle accompaniment of the musicians. Norma stood before him in her recreated wedding dress, tears streaming down her face, but smiling with a radiance that took George back to that 19-year-old bride who had changed his life forever. "I wrote a song for you, Norma Jean," George continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Not for the radio, not for the charts, not for anyone else in the world. Just for you, to tell you everything I should have been saying every single day for the past 54 years. He nodded to the musicians, and they began to play a melody that no one in the room had ever heard before. It was simple and beautiful, the kind of song that spoke directly to the heart, without needing elaborate production or fancy arrangements. When George began to sing, his voice carried all the love, gratitude, and devotion that had sustained their marriage through every challenge. "Norma Jean, you've been my constant star, guiding me home when I've wandered too far. Through the storms and the sunshine, the laughter and tears, you've been my anchor for all of these years. I promise again what I promised before, to love you completely until I can't anymore. And when my last breath leaves this old heart of mine, I'll find you in heaven and you'll still be mine." As the last notes faded away, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Norma was sobbing openly now, but they were tears of joy, of overwhelming love, of gratitude for this man who had just given her the most beautiful gift imaginable. Not just the song, not just the party, but the reminder that after all these years, she was still the center of his universe. Pastor Williams, who had married them originally and had somehow been convinced to drive 3 hours to be here tonight, stepped forward with a worn Bible in his hands. At 82 years old, he moved slowly but with dignity, his eyes twinkling with the joy of witnessing true love renewed. "George Harvey Strait, Jr. and Norma Jean Strait," he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades of blessing marriages. "You have asked me to witness your renewal of the sacred vows you made 54 years ago, but before we begin, I want everyone here to understand what we are truly celebrating tonight." He turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice growing stronger. "We live in a world where marriage is often treated as temporary, where commitment is seen as optional, where people give up on love when it becomes difficult. But these two people standing before us tonight are living proof that true love not only exists, but that it grows stronger with time, deeper with shared experience, more beautiful with each passing year." Pastor Williams opened his Bible to a passage he had marked years ago. "George and Norma, When I married you in 1971, you were children playing at being adults, full of dreams and hope, but with no real understanding of what lay ahead. Tonight you stand before us as people who have lived those dreams, who have faced unimaginable loss, who have celebrated incredible triumphs, and who have chosen each other every single day. George took Norma's hands in his, just as he had done 54 years ago, but now their hands were lined with age, marked by years of work and worry and joy. These were hands that had comforted each other through the devastating loss of their daughter, hands that had applauded at countless school plays and graduation ceremonies, hands that had held grandchildren and wiped away tears and celebrated victories both large and small. George, Pastor Williams continued, do you promise to continue loving Norma with the same devotion you have shown for 54 years, to honor her as your equal partner, to protect her heart as carefully as you protect your own, and to choose her every day for whatever years God grants you together? I do, George said, his voice strong and clear. I promise to love you, Norma Jean, with everything I have, everything I am, and everything I ever hope to be. I promise to never again cause you the pain I caused you this morning, even with the best of intentions. I promise to communicate better, to trust in your love for me, and to spend every day showing you how grateful I am that you chose me. Norma, the pastor turned to her, do you promise to continue loving George with the same grace and patience you have shown for 54 years, to stand beside him as his partner and best friend, to forgive his mistakes as he has forgiven yours, and to choose him every day for whatever years God grants you together? I do, Norma said, her voice breaking with emotion. I promise to love you, George, through whatever comes next. I promise to trust in your love for me, even when I don't understand your methods. I promise to be your safe harbor, your biggest supporter, and your most honest critic. I promise to keep choosing you every single day, just as I have for 54 years. Pastor Williams smiled and closed his Bible. Then, by the power vested in me, and witnessed by all these people who love you, I pronounce you husband and wife, renewed and recommitted. George, you may kiss your bride. Again. The kiss they shared was tender and full of promise, a perfect blend of the passion they had shared as young lovers and the deep abiding love they had built over more than half a century together. When they finally parted, the room erupted in applause and cheers, but George and Norma only had eyes for each other. As the evening progressed, there were toasts and stories, laughter and more tears. Bubba spoke about growing up with parents who showed him what true love looked like. George's bandmates performed some of his greatest hits, but also some of the songs that had special meaning for the family. Martha revealed that she had been George's co-conspirator for weeks, helping to coordinate the guest list and keep Norma distracted. The photographer captured every moment: Norma's face when she first saw the transformed room, George's expression when he sang his new song, the kiss that renewed their marriage, the joy of their family and friends as they celebrated love that had endured everything life could throw at it. As the night wound down and guests began to say their goodbyes, George and Norma found themselves alone in their living room, surrounded by the flowers and photographs and memories of the most perfect evening they could have imagined. Norma was still wearing her wedding dress, and George was still in his suit, both of them reluctant to end this magical night. "Thank you," Norma said simply, reaching up to touch George's face. "Thank you for reminding me why I fell in love with you in the first place." "Thank you for forgiving me for this morning," George replied, covering her hand with his. "Thank you for 54 years of loving me, even when I didn't deserve it. Thank you for being my partner, my best friend, my everything." They danced slowly to the music still playing softly in the background, holding each other close and marveling at how far they had come together. Tomorrow, the story of George Strait's romantic surprise would spread across social media and entertainment news, transforming what could have been a scandal into one of the most beautiful love stories in country music history. But tonight, they were just George and Norma, two people who had chosen each other more than half a century ago and who had just chosen each other again, promising to face whatever came next with the same love, faith, and commitment that had brought them this far. As they finally turned off the lights and headed to their bedroom, George stopped and looked back at the room where they had just renewed their vows. "You know what the best part of tonight was?" he asked. "What's that?" Norma replied, following his gaze. "Realizing that I get to wake up tomorrow morning married to my best friend, just like I have for the past 54 years, and just like I hope to for whatever years we have left." Norma smiled and took his hand, leading him toward their bedroom. "Come on, husband, let's go start the next chapter of our love story." And as they walked together into their future, both of them knew that the best was yet to come.